After my grandma died, my uncle took all the family assets and smirked. "You won't get a single cent." He thought he deleted all the digital archives, but a former bank manager handed me a secret envelope with the original trust. He cried in court when the judge read it. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached." My name is Morgan Ashford. I'm 34 years old, and until all of this happened, I thought my family was pretty ordinary. Not perfect, not especially close, just stable. The center of that stability was my grandmother, Eleanor Ashford. She built our family art gallery from the ground up and spent decades turning it into a respected business. Growing up, I spent countless afternoons helping her organize records and inventory. Most teenagers would have hated it. I loved it. "Details matter, Morgan," she always said. Then she'd tap a folder. "People forget conversations. Paperwork remembers." At the time, it sounded like one of those life lessons grandparents repeat. Later, those words would mean a lot more. When Eleanor passed away, the entire family felt the loss. The funeral was quiet. Friends came, employees came, artists came. For a few hours, nobody talked about money or inheritance. We just remembered her. A few days later, the family gathered again inside one of the gallery's conference rooms. This meeting felt completely different. Everyone knew the estate would eventually have to be discussed. My younger brother Liam sat beside me. Across the table sat our Uncle Victor. Victor had always been hard to read. He wasn't loud or openly hostile, but every conversation with him felt calculated. A family attorney sat next to him with several folders. I assumed we would review paperwork and discuss how the gallery would move forward. Nothing unusual. The attorney opened the meeting with a few formal comments. Then Victor leaned forward. "As most of you know," he said, "my mother updated her estate planning before her passing." I immediately looked at Liam. He looked just as confused. Neither of us had heard anything about updated plans. Victor continued. "Under her final instructions, operational control of the gallery and associated family assets now rests with me." The room went quiet. Not shocked. Just confused. Like everyone expected more information. But none came. Victor simply sat back. I frowned. "What exactly does that mean?" I asked. "It means I'll be overseeing the business moving forward," he replied. That was it. No explanation, no discussion about ownership, no mention of how assets would be divided. Nothing. The problem was that it sounded nothing like Eleanor. For years, she talked about keeping the gallery in the family and treating everyone fairly. She never discussed exact percentages with me, but she was always clear about one thing. The gallery belonged to the family, not one person. The more Victor talked, the less it sounded like her wishes. Liam finally spoke up. "Did Grandma explain why she changed everything?" Victor barely hesitated. She believed this was the best way to ensure stability. The answer felt rehearsed. The attorney began passing around several pages. I glanced down. They weren't legal documents, just summaries, bullet points and short explanations. I flipped through them. The wording was vague, too vague. "Can we see the actual documents?" I asked. The attorney offered a polite smile. "The formal records are being maintained as part of the estate process." That didn't answer my question. "Can the family review them?" Before the attorney could respond, Victor stepped in. "Everything has already been reviewed." His tone wasn't angry, it was dismissive, like the conversation was already over. Around the table, relatives exchanged quick looks. Nobody challenged him. Nobody supported him either. People just seemed uncomfortable. The meeting continued for another 20 minutes. Questions were asked. Few answers were given. Victor stayed in control the entire time. And somehow, when it ended, I felt less informed than when it started. People gathered their things and headed for the door. Victor remained behind with the attorney, speaking quietly. I watched them for a moment before grabbing my coat. Maybe there was a reasonable explanation. Maybe grief was making me suspicious. I wasn't ready to jump to conclusions. Outside, Liam caught up with me in the parking lot. We walked in silence for a few seconds. Then he glanced back toward the building. "Did you notice?" he asked quietly. "Notice what?" He frowned. The attorney handed out summaries. I nodded. "So?" Liam stopped walking. Uncle Victor wouldn't let anyone keep a copy. And suddenly I realized he was right. Liam's words stayed with me much longer than I expected. Not because they proved anything. They didn't. But once he pointed it out, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Why hand everyone summaries if the documents were legitimate? Why collect every copy before people left? I spent the drive home trying to convince myself there was probably a reasonable explanation. Estate attorneys handled things differently all the time. Families had complicated legal arrangements. Maybe I was reading too much into it. For a couple of days, I focused on work. I was an internal auditor for a large company, and quarter-end reporting was keeping everyone busy. Normally, that kind of work helped me clear my head. Not this time. I found myself zoning out during meetings. Twice I caught myself staring at spreadsheets without actually reading them. One afternoon, my manager looked across the conference table. "Morgan, you with us?" A few people laughed. I forced a smile. "Sorry, long week." That answer seemed to satisfy everyone. It didn't satisfy me. Because the truth was, I kept replaying that family meeting over and over. Victor's answers, the attorney's wording, the missing documents. None of it felt right. One evening, after finishing work, I opened my laptop at home. My original goal was simple. I wasn't trying to investigate anybody. I wasn't trying to start a legal battle. I just wanted reassurance. Something that would prove Liam and I were overthinking everything. Public business records were easy enough to access. A few searches, a few clicks. Nothing unusual. The gallery had always operated under the same company name for decades. I already knew that. I was mostly curious whether any major organizational changes had happened recently. At first, everything looked normal. The gallery, several properties, holding companies connected to the business. Nothing immediately alarming. I almost closed my laptop. Then I noticed something. One property was missing. I frowned. A building the gallery had owned for years wasn't listed where I expected it to be. Maybe I was remembering incorrectly. I searched again. Same result. The property still existed. But it wasn't listed under the gallery anymore. It belonged to another company. I stared at the screen. The company name meant nothing to me. I had never heard of it before. That alone wasn't proof of anything. Businesses restructure assets all the time. Still, curiosity got the better of me. I wrote the company name down. The next morning, I called Liam during my lunch break. "Quick question," I said. "That's usually how your dangerous questions start." I laughed. "Do you recognize this company name?" I read it to him. Silence. "Nope." "You've never heard Grandma mention it?" "No." "Victor?" "No." His answer came immediately. I leaned back in my chair. "Interesting?" Liam sighed. "Morgan." "What?" "Don't do this." "Do what?" "Turn yourself into a detective." "I'm not." "You're absolutely doing that." I couldn't help smiling, maybe because he wasn't completely wrong. "I'm just checking a few things." "Why?" I looked out the office window. Because I wanted peace of mind. Because something felt off. Because Grandma had spent her entire life documenting everything. Instead, I said, because I'm curious. Curiosity gets expensive in this family. That got a laugh out of both of us. The conversation shifted to normal things after that. his job, weekend plans, a baseball game he'd gone to. For a few minutes, life felt normal again, but once the call ended, my attention drifted right back to the company name. That evening, I sat down with my laptop again. This time, I decided to pull up the company's registration records. Nothing invasive, nothing private, just publicly available information. The kind of information anyone could access. The filing appeared on my screen. I skimmed through it casually at first. Company name, registration date, business address. Then I reached the section listing officers and directors. My eyes stopped moving. I looked away, then immediately looked back again, just to make sure I hadn't misread it. There it was, listed clearly on the registration. One of the names connected to the company was Victor Ashford, my uncle. I stared at Victor's name on the screen for a long time, not because it proved anything. Honestly, it didn't. If a property had been moved into a company he managed on behalf of the gallery, there could be legitimate reasons for that. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. The problem was that I suddenly had more questions than answers, and once that happens, it's hard to stop digging. A few days later, Liam agreed to meet me for coffee. He arrived carrying his usual expression whenever family drama came up, the expression that said, "Please don't make this worse than it already is." He sat down and pointed at my laptop. "That's never a good sign." I laughed. "Good to see you too. How deep are you into this now?" "I looked up a company registration." He groaned. "Oh no." "What?" "Morgan. Normal people grieve. You build spreadsheets." That actually made me laugh. Fair. For a while we talked about normal things. Work, weekend plans, a baseball game he'd gone to. Honestly, it was nice. The last few weeks had been heavy enough. Eventually, Liam leaned back. "Okay. Show me." I turned my laptop toward him. "This company." He squinted at the screen. "The one with Victor's name?" "Yeah." Liam shrugged. "I mean, that doesn't automatically mean anything." "I know." "He was involved in gallery operations." "I know." "He could have been managing assets." "I know." He pointed at me. "Then why do you look like you're about to arrest somebody?" "Because something feels weird." "Feeling weird isn't evidence." "Good thing I'm not a prosecutor." Liam rolled his eyes. That was usually how these conversations worked. I pushed. He pulled back. I questioned things. He searched for reasonable explanations. I clicked through property records, ownership histories, and filings. Nothing dramatic. At least not yet. Liam remained unconvinced. Honestly, this could be paperwork housekeeping. Maybe. Or tax planning. Maybe. Or something Grandma approved years ago. I paused. That's actually what I'm trying to figure out. His expression softened. Because he was right. I wasn't trying to prove Victor did something wrong. I was trying to understand what happened. We spent another 20 minutes reviewing records. Most of it was boring. Names, dates, addresses. Then I noticed something. I clicked on a transfer document. Liam was halfway through his coffee when I stopped talking. "What?" I zoomed in on the filing date. "Look at this." He leaned closer. The transfer wasn't recent. It wasn't connected to Eleanor's death. It happened years earlier, several years. Liam frowned. "Wait." I checked the date again. Same result. "That's before Grandma got sick." "Way before," Liam said. For the first time that afternoon, he didn't immediately defend Victor. He just stared at the screen, thinking. That caught my attention. Normally, Liam was the first person to offer an innocent explanation. Now he looked genuinely puzzled. "Did you know about this?" I asked. "No." "Did Grandma ever mention moving gallery property?" "No." He leaned back. The confidence he'd had earlier was fading. "That's strange," he admitted. Those 2 words carried more weight than he probably realized, because Liam almost never said things like that. I clicked through more records. Neither of us spoke much. The conversation had changed. We weren't debating anymore. We were both looking, trying to understand. A few minutes later, Liam pointed at the screen. "What's that number?" I followed his finger. "Transfer value." "Is that normal?" I opened a few comparable property records. Years of auditing had trained me to compare numbers almost automatically. I checked one sale, then another, then a third. My stomach tightened. Liam noticed. "What?" I kept looking, making sure I wasn't missing something obvious. The transfer price attached to the gallery property was far lower than similar properties in the area. Liam leaned forward. "Morgan," I slowly turned the laptop toward him. "Tell me if I'm reading this wrong." He looked down at the numbers, and his expression changed immediately. Liam kept staring at the screen. Then he leaned back and crossed his arms. "That's low." That was all he said. Not impossible, not illegal, just low. For the first time since this started, neither of us rushed to explain it away. A few minutes later, we left the coffee shop. Before getting into his car, Liam pointed at me. "Don't turn this into a full-time job. I have an actual full-time job." "You know exactly what I mean." I smiled. But honestly, he wasn't wrong. By that point, I was thinking about the records more than I wanted to admit. The strange thing was that I wasn't looking for a scandal. I was looking for a mistake. Some boring explanation that would make everything make sense. Instead, every answer seemed to create 2 new questions. Back at work, I tried focusing on my responsibilities. Emails, meetings, audit reports, normal life. For a few hours at a time, I could almost convince myself to stop thinking about family business. Then I'd remember a filing, or a date, or a number that didn't quite fit, and my attention would drift again. One afternoon, I stayed late after most people had gone home. The office was quiet. I opened the public records database again. I started tracing ownership histories, company names, property transfers, corporate registrations, the same way I would approach an audit. No assumptions, just follow the records. That mindset changed something. Up until then, I had been treating this like a family disagreement. But documents don't care about family relationships. They either match up or they don't. The more I looked, the more I noticed small inconsistencies. Nothing dramatic. A property moved here. A company formed there. A transaction involving entities with similar addresses. Each item alone seemed harmless. Together, they started forming patterns. I opened a spreadsheet. Just to organize things. That was probably the moment I crossed a line mentally. I wasn't simply curious anymore. I was tracking information. One evening, I looked up from my screen and realized almost 2 hours had passed. Several assets that had once been connected directly to gallery operations appeared to have moved through multiple companies over the years. The same names appeared repeatedly. Different companies, different transactions, similar people involved. One name kept showing up more often than the others. Victor, not always directly, sometimes through management roles, sometimes through ownership records. Nothing by itself looked suspicious, but the repetition caught my attention. The pattern felt deliberate. A few days later, I called Liam. "I found more." He groaned immediately. I knew this phone call was coming. "Just listen." I walked him through several transactions. Not conclusions, just facts, dates, ownership changes, entity names. By the end, he was quieter than usual. "So what's your theory?" he asked. "I don't have one." "Really? Really?" And that was the truth. I still didn't know what I was looking at. I only knew it wasn't getting simpler. After we hung up, I started thinking about people who had worked closely with Eleanor. One name stood out: a former gallery administrator who had retired years earlier. The kind of employee who knew everything happening behind the scenes. I found an old contact number and decided to call. The conversation started pleasantly. We exchanged small talk, talked briefly about Eleanor, shared a few memories. Then I asked a simple question. "Do you remember the gallery transferring any major properties years ago?" Silence. Not long. Just long enough to notice. "What makes you ask that?" she said. Her tone had changed. "I've been reviewing some records." Another pause. "Do you remember anything about companies connected to Victor?" The warmth disappeared immediately. "Oh." A few seconds passed. Then she cleared her throat. "Morgan, I really don't think I'm the right person to talk to about that. I'm only asking if you remember. I should go." The interruption caught me off guard. "Wait. I wasn't accusing anybody." "It was nice hearing from you." Click. The line went dead. I lowered the phone and stared at the screen. She hadn't sounded angry. She'd sounded nervous, and somehow that felt worse. The former administrator's reaction kept bothering me, not because of what she said, because of what she didn't say. She seemed eager to end the conversation the moment Victor's name came up. That wasn't evidence, but it was hard to ignore. Over the next couple of weeks, I reached out to more people who had worked with my grandmother, mostly phone calls, a few coffee meetings, nothing dramatic. I just wanted context. The responses were surprisingly similar. People happily shared stories about Eleanor, gallery events, artists, fundraisers, old memories. But whenever the conversation drifted toward ownership or estate planning, something changed. Voices became careful. Answers became shorter. Some people suddenly needed to leave. Others claimed they weren't involved in those matters. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Then the pattern repeated too many times. One afternoon, I met a retired accountant who had worked with the gallery years earlier. By the end of our conversation, he smiled and said, "Your grandmother was one of the most organized people I've ever met." That sounded exactly right. I laughed. That's probably the nicest thing anyone's ever said about her filing cabinets. Then I asked whether Eleanor took succession planning seriously. His smile faded slightly. "Very seriously." That got my attention. "What do you mean?" "She reviewed those arrangements constantly." "Trust documents?" He nodded. "Estate planning, trusts, asset structures." She believed family businesses failed when people avoided those conversations. That sounded exactly like Eleanor. She planned everything. The idea that she would suddenly stop paying attention to her trust arrangements didn't fit the person I knew. A few days later, I spoke with a former gallery consultant. Different person. Different background. Same conclusion. Eleanor was meticulous, she told me. About trust documents? About everything. By the end of that week, I'd heard the same theme from multiple people. Eleanor reviewed estate matters regularly. Eleanor believed in documentation. Eleanor planned ahead. None of them were accusing Victor of anything, but their descriptions didn't match the story he had presented to the family. What bothered me most wasn't the information, it was the hesitation. People seemed comfortable discussing Eleanor. They seemed comfortable discussing the gallery. But the moment conversations got too close to ownership, trust structures, or Victor, a wall appeared. Nobody directly told me to stop asking questions. Yet somehow, I felt like I was being warned. One evening, Liam called while I was organizing notes. "How many people have you talked to now?" "6, maybe 7. He groaned. "Morgan." "What?" "You're starting to sound like an investigative journalist." I laughed. "I'm not publishing anything. Yet." That got a smile out of me. Before hanging up, Liam suddenly got quiet. You know what's weird? What? The fact that nobody will give you a straight answer. That observation stayed with me. Because he was right. Nobody seemed surprised by my questions. Yet nobody wanted to discuss them either. The following afternoon, I came home and found an envelope from a law firm in my mailbox. My stomach tightened immediately. I opened it at the kitchen counter. The letter was short, professional, carefully worded. It stated that I should stop contacting individuals associated with the gallery and family business regarding internal financial matters. The signature at the bottom caught my eye. Victor's attorney. I read the letter twice, then a third time. Only one question kept running through my mind. How did Victor know who I'd been talking to? I read the letter again while standing in my kitchen. Then I called Liam. He answered on the second ring. Please tell me you're calling about something normal. I got a letter from Victor's attorney. Silence. Not a good sign. What kind of letter? I read parts of it out loud. By the time I finished, Liam let out a long breath. Okay. Okay? Yeah. Okay. I frowned. That's your response? What do you want me to say? I don't know. Maybe that it's strange? It is strange. Then why do you sound calm? Because for the first time since we'd started looking into things, Liam sounded tired. Not confused, not curious, tired. Morgan, he said, maybe this is where we stop. That caught me off guard. What? We don't know that anything illegal happened. I never said it did. We have questions, that's all. I walked toward the living room and sat down. The letter was still in my hand. He doesn't send a lawyer because people ask harmless questions. Or maybe he does because he's protecting the business. Even Liam didn't sound convinced by his own argument. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said something that surprised me. I don't want this to turn into a family war. The words hung there. Because underneath everything else, I understood exactly what he meant. Victor wasn't just some executive. He was our uncle. Every new question pushed us further into conflict with someone we'd known our entire lives. By the end of the call, neither of us was angry, just frustrated. For the first time since this started, we weren't on the same page. Liam wanted distance. I wasn't sure what I wanted anymore. That uncertainty followed me for days. I spent less time looking at records. I focused on work, went to the gym, met friends for dinner, tried to act like a normal person. And honestly, part of me hoped the feeling would fade. Maybe Liam was right. Maybe I was turning ordinary business decisions into something bigger. Maybe grief was making everything look suspicious. One Saturday afternoon, I found myself cleaning old boxes I'd brought home from Eleanor's office after her death. Nothing important. At least, that's what I'd assumed. Mostly photographs, old gallery brochures, event programs, stacks of notes that probably meant nothing anymore. I was halfway through one box when I found a folder I didn't recognize. It wasn't labeled clearly. Just a date written across the top. I almost set it aside. Then I noticed something. Several meeting notes were clipped together inside. Short summaries, names, dates, agenda items. The handwriting was Eleanor's. I knew it instantly. I sat down and started reading. Most of the notes were routine. Gallery operations, budget discussions, insurance reviews. Then a phrase caught my attention. Trust review meeting. I stopped. Read it again. Trust review meeting. A few pages later, I found another reference. Then another. Not detailed explanations, just brief notes, dates, names, reminders. But the phrase appeared multiple times. That didn't make sense. As far as I knew, nobody in the family had ever mentioned these meetings. Certainly not Victor, and definitely not during the estate discussion. I spent the next hour going through every page. The more I read, the more focused I became. The doubt I'd been feeling all week slowly started fading. Not because I had proof of anything, because I had something new, something real, a trail. One note mentioned scheduling documents for review. Another referenced updated trust records. A third contained only a few handwritten lines, short enough that I almost missed them. I leaned closer. There wasn't much there. Just a date, a reminder, and a name. I read it twice, then a third time. Helen Brooks. I had never heard that name before, yet Eleanor had written it down often enough that it clearly mattered. I stared at the note for several seconds. Then I grabbed my phone and opened a search window. Because suddenly I wanted to know exactly who Helen Brooks was. I expected tracking down Helen Brooks to take weeks. It took 3 days. That alone surprised me. A few searches led me to an old professional profile. From there, I found a phone number. I stared at it for almost 10 minutes before calling. Not because I was nervous about speaking to her, because I was tired of dead ends. Every lead so far had ended the same way. People became uncomfortable. Conversations got cut short. Questions went unanswered. I wasn't eager to repeat that experience. The call connected. A calm voice answered. Helen Brooks speaking. Hi, Helen. My name is Morgan Ashford. There was a brief pause. Ashford? Yes. Eleanor Ashford was my grandmother. The pause changed. Not awkward. Thoughtful. Oh my goodness. The warmth in her voice caught me off guard. I haven't heard that name in quite a while. For the first time in weeks, the conversation didn't feel defensive. We spoke for nearly 20 minutes. Mostly about Eleanor, the gallery, old memories. At one point, Helen laughed and said, Your grandmother never trusted a document she hadn't reviewed herself. I smiled. That sounds familiar. No, Morgan, I'm serious. Her tone remained friendly, but there was conviction behind it. She reviewed everything. That sentence stuck with me. Eventually, Helen agreed to meet for coffee. When I arrived, she was already there. Late 60s, professional, the kind of person who immediately made you feel comfortable. She stood up and gave me a quick hug before I could even offer a handshake. For a moment, it felt strangely personal, like I wasn't meeting a stranger. I was meeting someone who had known a part of my grandmother's life I never fully saw. We talked for almost an hour, not just about business, about Eleanor, the person, the grandmother, the woman who carried hard candy in her purse and somehow remembered everyone's birthday. Helen told stories I'd never heard before, stories that made me laugh, stories that made me miss Eleanor all over again. For a little while, the investigation faded into the background. Then the conversation naturally drifted toward estate planning. I watched carefully, waiting for the same discomfort I'd seen from everyone else. It never came. Helen simply nodded. Yes, I remember those discussions. That got my attention immediately. You do? Of course. She took a sip of coffee. Your grandmother believed planning ahead was an act of kindness. That sounded exactly like Eleanor. Helen continued. She worried about what would happen after she was gone. Not because she feared death. She worried about family conflict. I looked down at my cup and laughed softly. Well, that part didn't exactly work. Helen smiled. No, apparently not. The conversation remained calm. No dramatic revelations, no secret confessions, just context. But honestly, it was the most useful conversation I'd had so far, because for the first time, someone was speaking openly. Did she ever talk about how assets would be distributed? I asked. Helen nodded slowly. Generally, yes. My heart sped up. I tried not to show it. What do you remember? Not exact percentages. She shook her head. That wasn't my role. I waited. But I absolutely remember her discussing a trust structure designed to benefit multiple family members. I sat completely still, not because it proved anything, because it matched everything I remembered hearing over the years. Keep the gallery in the family. Treat people fairly. Protect what was built. Nothing about concentrating control in one person. Helen continued speaking. Carefully. Thoughtfully. Never exaggerating. Never claiming certainty where she didn't have it. That made her easier to trust. By the time we finished, I felt lighter than I had in weeks. Not because I had evidence, because I finally had someone who wasn't afraid to talk. Someone outside the family. Someone who remembered things. As we stood to leave, I thanked her for meeting me. "No problem," she said. Then she hesitated. It was subtle. Just enough to catch my attention. "What is it?" I asked. Helen looked down for a second, thinking, trying to remember something. When she looked back up, her expression had changed. "I may be mistaken." I waited. "There were a lot of documents over the years." She nodded to herself. Then she said something that made my stomach tighten. "There was a signed version." I blinked. "A signed version of what?" "The trust." She frowned slightly. "At least?" Her voice trailed off. Then she looked directly at me. "At least, I'm almost certain there was." I couldn't stop thinking about what Helen said. There was a signed version. Not a possibility. Not a rumor. A memory. Maybe an imperfect one, but still a memory. The problem was that memories aren't evidence. I needed something more. Over the next few weeks, Helen and I spoke regularly, sometimes by phone, sometimes over coffee. The conversations became surprisingly comfortable. At one point, I realized I was looking forward to them. She wasn't just helping me piece together documents. She was helping me understand my grandmother from a different perspective. One afternoon, Helen laughed while telling a story. Eleanor once postponed an entire meeting because one page was missing from a binder. I smiled. "That sounds ridiculous." "It was ridiculous." Helen shook her head. "But that's why I struggle with this." "With what?" "The idea that important trust documents would simply disappear." That comment stayed with me, because it echoed a thought I'd been having for weeks. The more I learned about Eleanor's habits, the less likely it seemed that she would leave something so important unresolved. At the same time, my own research continued. Only now it felt more organized, less emotional, less reactive. I built timelines, matched dates, compared notes from Eleanor's files with public records. Instead of chasing random leads, I started focusing on specific questions. Who had access to the trust documents? When were they last reviewed? Who was present during those discussions? The process felt slow, painfully slow sometimes. Several leads went nowhere. A few people never returned my calls. Others claimed they couldn't remember details. There were days when I wondered whether Liam had been right all along. Maybe I was chasing something that no longer existed. Maybe the answers had disappeared years ago. One evening, I met Liam for dinner. He listened while I updated him on everything Helen had shared. For once, he didn't interrupt. Didn't play devil's advocate. Didn't search for innocent explanations. He simply listened. When I finished, he sat quietly for a moment. Then he asked, "You trust her?" "I do." "Why?" I thought about it. Because Helen never exaggerated. Whenever she wasn't sure about something, she said so. Whenever she remembered something clearly, she explained why. She wasn't trying to convince me of anything. She was just telling me what she knew. "I think she's being honest," I said. Liam slowly nodded. "So do I." That answer surprised me. A few months earlier, Liam would have pushed back immediately. Now he looked as invested as I felt. For the first time since the estate meeting, it felt like we were fully working together. A few days later, Helen called unexpectedly. I remembered something. I grabbed a notebook immediately. What? There was a brief pause. I keep thinking about those trust discussions. Okay. And I don't think it was only me. I waited. There was someone else there. My heart sped up. Who? Samuel Price. The name meant nothing to me. Helen noticed the silence. He was a longtime business associate of Eleanor's. What kind of associate? Someone she trusted. That got my attention. Helen rarely described people that way. Was he involved with the trust? I don't know exactly how involved. She sounded frustrated with herself, but I distinctly remember him being present during at least one important discussion. That was the first genuinely new lead I'd received in weeks. Not a theory. Not a pattern. An actual person. As soon as we hung up, I started searching. Finding Samuel wasn't easy. His business interests had changed over the years. Several old contact numbers were disconnected. A few emails bounced back. For a while, it felt like another dead end. Still, I kept trying. A voicemail. An email. Another voicemail. Nothing. Days passed, then a week. Then another. I started checking my phone more often than I wanted to admit. Every notification got my attention. Every unknown number made me hopeful for a second. Most of the time, it was nothing. One afternoon, I was leaving work when my phone buzzed. I almost ignored it. Then I noticed the number. Unknown. I answered. Hello? A man's voice responded. Calm. Older. Is this Morgan Ashford? I stopped walking. Yes. This is Samuel Price. For a moment, I forgot what to say. Finally, I managed. Thank you for calling me back. I received your messages. His tone was polite but careful. I wasn't sure whether I should get involved. I waited. A few seconds passed. Then he sighed softly. I suppose it's time we talked. My grip tightened on the phone. Samuel continued. I can meet you this week. I glanced toward the parking lot and felt something I hadn't felt in a while. Samuel chose a quiet restaurant for our meeting. Nothing fancy. Just somewhere we could talk without being interrupted. I arrived early because, honestly, I was nervous. For weeks, Helen had been the only person willing to discuss what she remembered. Now I was sitting down with someone who had supposedly been present during those trust conversations. I kept my expectations low. Memories fade. People get details wrong. I wasn't expecting proof. Just clarity. A few minutes later, Samuel arrived. We exchanged introductions and spent a few minutes talking about Eleanor. Like everyone else, he described her the same way. Organized, prepared, stubborn when she needed to be. Samuel laughed. Your grandmother never attended a meeting without notes. That sounds about right. No, I mean never. Then the conversation shifted. I explained why I had contacted him, the missing trust documents, Victor's claims, everything. Samuel listened quietly. When I finished, he nodded. I've been wondering if someone would eventually ask me about that. My stomach tightened. What do you remember? I remember trust discussions. Not rumors, not assumptions. Actual discussions. There were multiple meetings, he said, and there was paperwork. I stayed quiet and let him continue. Eleanor was reviewing how family assets would be handled. Then he said something that immediately got my attention. The structure wasn't intended for one person. I looked up. What do you mean? It was supposed to benefit multiple family members. Almost the exact same thing Helen had told me. Different person, different conversation, same memory. Samuel wasn't claiming to know every legal detail, but one thing was clear. What he remembered didn't match Victor's version of events. When the meeting ended, I walked back to my car feeling something I hadn't felt in a while. Confidence, not certainty, just confidence that I wasn't imagining things. Back home, I organized my notes again. Helen's recollections, Samuel's recollections, property records, financial filings. The more information I gathered, the harder it became to view everything as a misunderstanding. Then I noticed something else, something unrelated to the trust. I was reviewing company financial statements connected to the gallery and several related entities. Most of it was boring. Expenses, transfers, routine accounting entries. Then a few transactions stood out. I compared dates, checked supporting records, looked again. Some expenses appeared to have been paid through company accounts, but I couldn't find any connection to gallery operations. Maybe there was an explanation. Maybe I was missing context, but the pattern kept repeating. One evening, Liam came over with takeout. I barely touched my food. He noticed immediately. "Okay, what did you find now?" I turned my laptop toward him. He studied the numbers for a minute, then frowned. "Wait. Exactly." He kept reading. "Why would the company pay for that? I can't figure it out." For a while, neither of us spoke. The trust questions were one thing. The financial records were something else. Now both seemed to be pointing in the same direction. Liam leaned back. "This doesn't feel like a misunderstanding anymore." For the first time, neither of us tried to defend Victor. Neither of us looked for another explanation. We were looking at the same facts and reaching the same conclusion. Something needed to be investigated properly. A few minutes later, I closed my laptop. Liam looked at me. "What are you doing?" I took a breath. For months, I'd been doing everything myself, making calls, reviewing records, following leads. But I had reached the point where I needed legal advice, real legal advice, not guesses, not theories. I picked up my phone. Liam watched quietly. "Who are you calling?" I opened a contact I'd saved weeks earlier. Then I pressed dial. An attorney named Maya Bennett. Maya Bennett didn't tell me what I wanted to hear. She told me what I needed to hear. Our first meeting lasted nearly 2 hours. I brought everything: property records, corporate filings, notes from Helen, notes from Samuel, financial documents, spreadsheets. By the end, papers covered half her conference table. Maya reviewed everything quietly, occasionally stopping to ask questions. Not emotional questions, legal ones. The difference mattered. Finally, she closed a folder. "You've done a lot of work." I wasn't sure if that was praise. "Is that good or bad?" She smiled. "Both." For the first time in weeks, I laughed. Then she got serious. "Right now you have concerns, legitimate concerns." I nodded. "What you don't have is access to the records that would answer them." That had been my biggest problem from the beginning. Most of what I had gathered came from public records and conversations. Helpful, but incomplete. Maya outlined the next step: formal requests, trust records, financial documents, corporate files, anything connected to the estate and the family assets. It sounded surprisingly boring. No dramatic confrontations, no courtroom speeches, just paperwork, a mountain of paperwork. Honestly, my grandmother would have approved. A few weeks later, the requests were officially submitted. That was the moment everything changed. Until then, Victor had mostly ignored me. Now attorneys were involved. Deadlines existed. Questions required answers. The entire situation shifted from family tension to a legal process. Victor responded through his lawyer, never directly. Not once. That part bothered me more than I expected. This was still my uncle, the same man who showed up at birthdays and holidays. Now every message arrived as formal legal correspondence. One afternoon, Liam called. Did Victor really respond through his attorney? Every single time. He sighed. That can't be a good sign. No, it isn't. By then, I was spending most of my energy reviewing documents as they arrived. Some records clarified things. Others made them murkier. Maya and I went through everything carefully: dates, transfers, emails, meeting notes, looking for missing pieces. One afternoon, she stopped scrolling through a digital archive. "What?" I asked. She turned her monitor toward me. "Look at the timeline." I leaned closer. At first, it looked ordinary. Then I noticed it. Records existed before Eleanor's death. Records existed months afterward. But between those periods, certain files were simply missing. Not entire databases, just specific records, specific communications, specific archive entries. Enough to stand out. Could that happen naturally? I asked. Possibly. The answer didn't help. Over the next week, more gaps appeared. Small ones. The kind most people would never notice. Eventually, Maya arranged for a digital records specialist to review the archive history. I tried not to expect much. Most leads ended with uncertainty. Life kept moving while we waited. Work deadlines, family obligations, normal responsibilities. Some days the investigation felt all-consuming. Other days it felt strangely distant. Then Maya called. Her voice immediately caught my attention. "Morgan, do you have a minute?" My stomach tightened. What happened? The forensic review came back. I sat down at my kitchen table. What did they find? They aren't making final conclusions. I waited. But? A brief silence. The missing files may not be the result of routine archival problems. I stared at the documents scattered across my table. Maya continued carefully. There are indicators suggesting certain records were intentionally removed after Eleanor's death. For a moment, I said nothing. Months earlier, this had started with a strange meeting and a few unanswered questions. Now a forensic review was suggesting that at least some missing records might not have disappeared by accident. Nothing was proven yet. But it was the first time an independent expert had pointed in that direction, and once that possibility existed, it was impossible to ignore. Because if those files were deliberately removed, then someone had chosen which records stayed, and which ones vanished. I sat in the courtroom holding a notebook I hadn't written in for nearly 20 minutes. That alone told me how nervous I was. Across the room, Victor sat beside his attorneys. He looked tired. The confidence he carried at the beginning of all this was gone. The smirks, the dismissive comments, the certainty that nobody would challenge him. None of it survived once the facts started piling up. And it wasn't because of one dramatic revelation. It was dozens of smaller pieces finally fitting together. The reconstructed trust records, the property transfers, the financial documents, the missing digital files, the testimony from people who had known Eleanor for years. None of those things alone told the entire story. Together, they painted a picture that became harder to ignore. Helen testified calmly. She described Eleanor's habit of reviewing trust documents and planning for multiple family members. Samuel's testimony matched many of the same memories. Independent, consistent. Watching them speak was emotional for a simple reason. They weren't fighting for me. They were helping Eleanor's voice reach the courtroom. The financial evidence carried its own weight. Records showed assets moving through related companies, transactions benefiting entities connected to Victor, expenses that appeared difficult to justify as legitimate gallery business. Every answer seemed to lead back to the same place. At one point, Maya leaned toward me. People expect court cases to turn on one big moment. I nodded. She smiled faintly. Most of them don't. She was right. There was no shocking confession, no dramatic surprise witness, just months of work, documents, timelines, records, the truth arriving piece by piece. Liam sat beside me throughout most of the hearings. Months earlier, he wanted nothing to do with this. Now he reviewed exhibits during breaks and caught details I missed. Somewhere along the way, we stopped being confused grandchildren. We became caretakers of something bigger. Not the money, not the properties, the responsibility to make sure Eleanor's wishes weren't buried under missing paperwork. During one recess, Liam handed me a bottle of water. "You know something weird?" he said. "What?" "I don't even care about the inheritance anymore." I laughed softly. "Yeah. Do you?" I thought about the months of stress and research. Then I shook my head. Not really. Because the fight had changed. The inheritance started the investigation. It wasn't what kept it going. What kept it going was the feeling that Eleanor's wishes had been pushed aside. And if there was one thing I knew about my grandmother, it was this: she never left important things unfinished. The final days of testimony passed quietly. Victor spoke very little. His attorney spoke for him. The evidence spoke louder. Some questions remained unanswered. Some records were never recovered. But uncertainty no longer favored Victor the way it once had. The overall picture had become difficult to dispute. When the hearing ended, people gathered their belongings and slowly filed out. I stayed seated for a moment, thinking about everything that had happened since Eleanor's funeral. Helen, Samuel, Maya, Liam, even the people who were initially afraid to talk. All of them had helped in some way. The judge announced that a final ruling would come after reviewing the remaining submissions. Not today. Soon, but not today. As everyone headed for the exit, I looked down at the notebook in my hands. For the first time in months, I felt relief. Not because the fight was over, not because victory was guaranteed, but because the truth was finally standing where it belonged, in plain sight. The missing documents no longer controlled the story. The evidence had found its way back together. And now the decision belonged to the judge. Outside, Liam and I walked toward the parking lot. Neither of us said much. The afternoon felt lighter. Before getting into his car, he smiled. "You know, Grandma would have hated all this." I laughed. "Oh, absolutely." "She also would have loved the paperwork." That made me laugh harder than it should have. And for the first time in a long time, it felt good. Looking back, I realized the fight was never really about inheritance. It was about proving that Eleanor's wishes hadn't disappeared along with the missing documents. The answer was finally within reach. All that remained was for the court to decide whether the evidence had spoken clearly enough. And if you were in my position, would you have kept digging after that first family meeting, or would you have walked away? I still wonder how many people would have stopped long before reaching this point.